Hey guys, it's me again. Today I'm going to be doing my persuasive speech. I'm joined by three adults whom I shall not disclose for this. That's what they asked me to do. Um, I chose to do my persuasive essay on abuse in the sense of, be it child, elder, self, spousal, or parental. I've been through some of that myself, so I chose something close to home. Um, so I guess I'll just get started. So a sound we all know is yelling. Everyone's been yelled at one point or another, and everyone has yelled at someone else, be it between two adults or between a child and an adult or a child to a child or just pretty much the latter. But something that doesn't tend to occur to a lot of people is that yelling and tone of voice can be a really big sign of abuse. And that's something that we as people tend to ignore because either we don't realize it or we just it goes over our heads. We don't think about it. And so, as many of us know, abuse is a really big problem in the States, all over the world. And so, in short, I'll talk a little bit about my personal story, and then I'll go on to talk about some of the things that I found. So for me personally, the first time that I experienced abuse was when I was 3. My biological father and my mother didn't quite get along at the time, and so my father, when my mother was not there, he would beat my sister and I. And I was young, I got lucky, but my sister, she had the worst side of it since she was 5 years older than me. But as time went on, my parents got divorced a little bit after, or shortly after, I should say. And for a while, there was no abuse in my life. But when I was 7, I was sexually abused by a friend of mine, who most of you are probably thinking, oh no, it's a boy, but believe it or not, it was a girl who was in my class. We were the same age. And I did not talk to my family about that because, as in many families, when it comes to things like that, you're either told as a child to keep it a secret because it's just between the two people, or in my case, your family is so terrifying that when you go to them about even something as simple as a scraped knee, they brush it aside and say you're fine, which a scraped knee is much different, but at the time I knew that it wasn't something I could necessarily disclose with my family, and so I didn't, which was probably a bad decision because I could have gotten counseling, but my single mother of 2 just had so much going on that even me at the age of 8 knew that I should probably not add more onto her pile of stressors. Fast forward a few years, and the next time I experienced abuse was my late sophomore, early junior year of high school. I was dating someone at the time who, on the outside, he seemed perfect, and in reality, he was emotionally, physically, and sexually abusive. Now, as many people tend to think when I say things like that, it is untrue that I was not a virgin when I got married, that I managed to keep away from him. But if we'd been together longer and I had not dumped him, I don't know if that would have been the case. But as time went on during our relationship, I realized that it was actually really bad, and that I had been too depressed throughout the entirety of the relationship that I just kind of let what happened happen. And so I broke up with him, and I then spent months and months avoiding him since we went to the same school and the same church. And I didn't tell anyone at church about it, and I didn't tell even my mom about it because, again, I had seen in the past how the church had handled situations where girls had been in similar situations between like the youth groups and between adults, and it was just, everyone brushed it off. No one really cared about what had happened, and the few that did care cared a little too much and ended up freaking out the kids instead of helping them. And so in my situation, I got lucky. The guy moved away that summer, and so I did not see him again until he suddenly appeared at my graduation, because there were a few friends that he had that still went to our school that he came to see graduate, and it was really hard to avoid him because he kept trying to find me, but I got lucky because my senior year, I met my husband, and by the time I graduated, he actually proposed the day that I graduated from high school. And so I stayed with him, and when my past abuser saw my husband, or at the time boyfriend, soon in a couple hours to be fiance, he strayed away and decided that he was twice his size, and that wasn't necessarily something he wanted to attempt to get into. Plus, there were thousands of people around that knew me better than they knew him. But moving on, abuse of children by adults is a really big problem in the world, but even specifically in the United States, it's bad. Even specifically, I found an article, 2 articles actually, that were basically made by USA Today, but they were like subsequents of them, if that's the right word. And they talked about abuse in different areas of the world. And one of them was in just Colorado alone, and they did an article about how between the years of 2012 and 2016, there were a lot of child abuse cases, and it gave an example of like 1,060, I think, child abuse cases, and it said of those, about more than half of them were dismissed, and that wasn't including like the felony ones. So it's, personally, I think that's kind of bad. But of course, obviously, there were more cases than that between those 5 years. And it went on even a little later to say that of the like 20,000 of them, over 800 of them were felonies, which is insane. But it happens. It does. And usually when you're a child, parents, it's not necessarily the parents' fault, don't get me wrong, but usually what happens is that someone doesn't upkeep with the child, and things fall through the cracks, and it happens. I mean, of the thousands of people that I have met over the past 20 years of my life, I've met maybe 5 people total who have said that they've never been abused in any way, shape, or form, and I don't believe them. It's impossible to believe them, because there's so many different forms of abuse. There's so many different kinds. I mean, how could you even manage to not be abused emotionally, at least? I mean, there's even financial abuse. People forget that exists. But, emotional abuse is probably one of the worst, because you never know, that you get molded into this thing that isn't you, and you don't usually tend to realize it until it gets really bad, and then one day you wake up and you're like, well, crap, I'm being abused, what am I going to do? And then you have to figure out how to get out of it. But most types of emotional abuse, believe it or not, are in the sense of a parent to a child. So parents are not equipped to handle, children are not equipped to handle needy parents. So parents who are insecure need to find ways to work together towards their insecurities instead of falling back on their children, because that's unfair for the child. In my situation, growing up with a single mother, I wouldn't necessarily say I was emotionally abused, but she relied on me and my sister too much because there was no one else there for her, and I don't blame her for that, and I try not to blame anybody for that, but I'm human, and blame tends to have to fall somewhere as a human. But, as a child, if I was 8, and, having a parent that was probably 3 times my age at least, and having her try to talk to me about things and rely on me about things that I didn't understand was really hard. It was difficult, and it's difficult for all children who are put in those kinds of situations. Children need to be children, and when you force them to grow up too soon, sometimes that can have really devastating effects on them. It's bad. It's really bad. And so in the end, children, they're forced to take sides between the 2 parents, because one parent or both parents are too emotionally unstable or insecure is the word I want, in themselves, that they don't know what to do, and so instead of turning to the other parent, which is what they should do, or turning to another adult, which I would suggest against, because if you're married, you're a unit, you should talk to each other, but sometimes, talking to someone else can be more helpful. That conversations from adult to adult are what's necessary in a marriage or in a relationship between 2 adults, but when you try to force that onto a child of any age, even a teenager, it's unfair to them, because you're going to force them to pick sides between the 2 parents. I got lucky. My mother never said anything bad about my father, and I didn't learn or remember even what my father had done until I got to be about the age of 12, and my mom sat me down and said, look, your dad's not coming back, and this is what he did, and this is why you shouldn't want him to come back. And personally, I'm not a fan of family secrets, but that's a whole different story for a different day. Going on to teenage relational abuse, Teenage dating violence is huge. When I was, even in the 4 years of high school, every single year I knew at least 3 girls that struggled so hard to get out of a relational abusive relationship, whether it was sexual abuse, emotional abuse, financial abuse, of any kind of abuse that's out there. They struggled with it because when they went to an adult, even counselors at school, they brushed it off and they were like, or they'd say like, do you want me to call social services? We can get your parents involved. And a lot of teenagers don't trust their parents because their parents don't handle the situation correctly. Their parents either freak out or say the kid just wants attention. There are very few parents that are in that in between that say, okay, what can we do to fix this? And how are we going to do that to fix this, And, whether it's taking their child out of school or trying to force or open, rather, a case against the other student, it's very rare. It doesn't happen. Usually the kids are just told, oh, they're just teenagers, they'll get over it, or they're just saying that now. But honestly, as someone who was there seeing this happen to my friends, I can tell you that that was not the case. And it was very, very hard to watch. But, I found another article written by the Pentagram, which I believe is a military-based website. And it had a statistic saying that between the ages of 11 and 17, 22% of women and 15% of women have had some kind of abuse happen to them, be it psychological, emotional, sexual, any of those kinds. And mostly it's because of social media. Abuse and fear go hand in hand. So a type of abuse is threatening. That's emotional and sexual in two different, kind of mushed together, in the sense that, if you take pictures of yourself not wearing anything and you send them to your at the time significant other, those are out there forever. Even if you delete them, they're still there. Someone can find them. And if you leave someone who's abusive and they have those pictures, they can use them against you, and they will. And I have seen women who have been threatened by men that they had dated with that exact threat. And some of them fall apart and go back to the guy. Others, they're so unbelievably strong, I would not be able to do it. They take those pictures they're being threatened with and they post them on social media with the screenshots of the person threatening them so that they can expose the person. And that takes a lot of guts to do that. I would be terrified to do that because on one hand, you're completely opening yourself and throwing yourself out there to be seen by everyone you know. And then on the other hand, abusers don't always stop there. Just because you're going to throw your pictures out there for everyone to see doesn't mean that they're going to suddenly stop threatening you. But sometimes they do. You get lucky sometimes. You never know. But moving on to abuse in marriage. We as Christians fail in this area because God said marriage is supposed to last forever. And so when things start happening, our instant response is, how do we fix it, or how do we turn a blind eye to it? And if you're in the relationship, it's how do we fix it? And if you're outside the relationship, it's how do we turn a blind eye to it, because we'd rather it not exist instead of focusing on the fact that it's there and it's happening. And the only way to get rid of it is to address it. You can't necessarily fix abuse. You have to address it, because if you don't address it, it will get out of hand, or it will shrink very quickly, only because very soon it's going to explode. Because sometimes things implode before they explode. And so, even me personally, I did not know until I was 12 years of age, or rather, I did not remember because I had repressed memories until I was 12 years of age about the abuse that my mother went through because of my father. I thought he was just abusive towards us, but later, a few years later, I was talking to my sister about it, and it turns out that my father was abusive to my mother too. And my world fell apart because all these years I felt like I had been so selfish towards my mother all of a sudden, because I thought it was just me that had been abused and just my sister had been abused and mom had never gone through any of it, and that wasn't true. It wasn't. And I didn't know it at the time, and when I learned that, I was just devastated. And, to conclude, we as Christians like to pretend that abuse is not happening instead of trying to help someone. And when people come to us trying to tell us, even people who make jokes about it, they're trying to tell you, something's going on. and they don't know how to do whatever it is that needs to be done to fix whatever the problem is or how to get out of that relationship. And when you're dating someone, even if you're engaged, you can break it off, you can move away, you can do those things. When you're married, we as Christians say you're setting it, you're done, there's no getting out of it, you're pushed together as one, and you have to stay because you're married, and that's what marriage is. And I personally feel like we fail a lot of women and a lot of men. They get abused too by their wives, and we fail those people. But instead of trying to ignore them, we should find a way to try to help them. Whether it's working in a shelter or trying to do research to see how you can, where you can maybe donate money, things like that. Things like that exist. And we need to stop pretending that they don't, and we need to stop pretending that abuse does not exist. Abuse is a terrible offense. It happens everywhere. It happens every day. Your next door neighbor could be being abused, and you might not hear it, and you might not know. But all it takes is getting to know that person and getting them to open up little by little, and eventually you will learn about those kinds of things. Everyone in the world is broken in some way. And for some ridiculous reason, instead of helping each other and encouraging each other to be better and to get over those things and to just make them part of us, but not in a detrimental way, we brush it off and pretend that, no, there's no way that could have happened to that person. That person's so perfectly fine. And that actually hurts that person more because you're not accepting something that happened to them. But on top of that, you're making them remember it by not accepting it. You're making it worse for them. And so, lastly, I'm going to challenge you. Abuse is a big problem in the world. So the question is, what are you going to do about it?